James Whitey Bulger lived off the grid for at least 14 years after working nearly to retirement age as a member of Boston's organized crime community. He was finally captured at the age of 82 with $822,198 in cash stuffed into the walls of his Santa Monica apartment, much of it bundled $100 bills. Bulger hid in broad daylight under an assumed name and identity. In a world of ever more pervasive surveillance systems and decreasing public capacity to control them, it's no wonder that some people want to live off the grid. Around the globe, we have new and innovative ways of capturing information and data. These systems range from license plate readers and closed-circuit TV cameras to drones, biometric identification, and other novel ways of collecting data. Beyond the physical world, big data has magnified our ability to collect information in the digital world so that governments and commercial data aggregators are able to create detailed pictures of us. Your wedding registry is a window into your soul, whether you realize it or not. This proliferation of sensor platforms is compounded by two other related phenomena. One is the increased power of data analytics to perform correlation analysis of disparate data streams. Today's algorithms can find patterns in billions, if not trillions of data points. The corresponding phenomena is the ever-decreasing cost of data storage. All the analysis in the world would be useless if we could not afford to store the data in the first place. But what cost $100 to store back in 1984 can be retained today for less than a penny. And the legal structures we put in place in the 1970s are proving to be less adaptable or effective than they need to be under the pressure of technological change. Judicial systems just move too slowly to keep pace with changing reality. Meanwhile, legislative and executive systems are too hierarchical, too top-down to be effective. This leaves us at the mercy of the captains of technology. And their economic incentives are skewed by their own understandable self-interest. In short, we're at a precipice, uncertain whether democracy and surveillance can continue to coexist. Faced with this challenge, many people want to simply check out, to cloak themselves in the veil of anonymity and become invisible. In this lecture, let's look at identity and the anonymity phenomenon. Why is identity important? You might think it isn't really, but if you've ever had your identity stolen, you know that who you are and how we identify you are critical to your well-being. The reason for that really lies in the idea of attribution. Once having established your identity, we can attribute to you corresponding characteristics and responsibilities. Today, we tie almost everything to identity. Your license to practice medicine, for example, and your legal means to leave behind your accumulated wealth to your spouse or children. Perhaps more importantly, the idea of attribution lies at the heart of our system for maintaining social order. We want to identify wrongdoers so that they might be punished, and thereby deter bad actors from even considering the possibility of engaging in malicious behavior. So although we sometimes talk about the issue of surveillance as one of privacy or even liberty, in some ways, government's oversight is essentially tied to identity. Without verifiable identities, we'd have a world of irresponsible actors. But of course, with verified identities, we run into the problem of identity as a means of control. The tension between this concept of security and control is palpable. In the United States, mandatory participation in a universal identification system would be politically unfeasible. You have but to say the phrase, "Your papers, please," or "national identity card" to evoke a visceral adverse reaction. In China, by contrast, those types of identification systems are becoming mandatory. All Chinese have a unique identity document. Chinese officials have, for example, expanded a program that requires users of microblog servers to disclose their identity to the government in order to post comments online. Mark Rotenberg of the Electronic Privacy Information Center says that Internet identification is a principal means by which China controls its citizens. He provides 3 examples: mandatory registration requirements, requirements on Internet service providers, and the regulation of Internet cafes in China. The American tradition leans, though not fully, in the other direction. In many respects, it sometimes even encourages the ability of citizens to maintain their anonymity as they participate in civil society. Anonymous and pseudonymous speech has a very long history in the United States. Just think of the debates that occurred at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. Newspapers published essays under pen names like Brutus, Cato, and the Federal Farmer. The most famous essays of all, collected in the Federalist Papers, were published under the pseudonym Publius. We know them today to have been written by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. But at the time, their true identities were cloaked in anonymity. Now, all that might seem like ancient history, but it really isn't. Indeed, the absolute right to anonymity, at least in the context of political speech, is alive and well today. The proof is found in the Supreme Court case McIntyre versus Ohio Elections Commission. Ohio had a problem, or what they thought was a problem, in the proliferation of anonymous campaign leaflets. You know the type. They're stuck in your door during election campaigns. Usually, they do no more than ask you to vote for candidate X. But sometimes, and perhaps with increasing frequency these days, the pamphlets, like our television ads, are more negative. And when anonymous, they sometimes even become scurrilous. They might allege, for example, that candidate Y has fathered a child out of wedlock or committed a felony. And often the allegations are simple falsehoods. Fearful of this result, Ohio passed a law requiring anyone who distributed a pamphlet to put a name and attribution on it, much like TV ads are forced to say that they're paid for by candidate Z. Ohio wanted the campaign leaflets to carry a statement published by the Committee for A, or something like that. Margaret McIntyre was an Ohio taxpayer who passed out pamphlets opposing a proposed increase in school tax. The State Elections Commission found her guilty of violating the Ohio statute that forbade the distribution of campaign literature that does not contain the name and address of the person or campaign official issuing the literature. But when the commission fined her, McIntyre challenged the identification requirement. You can probably see both sides of the argument. The case for anonymity is that it facilitates the expression of unpopular views. As the Supreme Court said, anonymity provides a way for a writer who may be personally unpopular to ensure that readers will not prejudge her message simply because they do not like its proponent. The court also noted that one's choice to seek anonymity might be motivated by fear of economic or official retaliation, by concern about social ostracism, or merely by a desire to preserve as much of one's privacy as possible. On the other hand, as the state of Ohio argued, anonymity can be a cloak for malicious speech. The balance is not ineluctably set in either direction, and the Supreme Court was called upon to resolve the conflict. Relying on American history and on the values underlying the marketplace of ideas, the High Court recognized a First Amendment right to anonymous political speech and struck down the Ohio law. Though the context of the case is important, politics and elections may represent only a subset of free speech and anonymity rules, many see the Supreme Court's decision as stating a broader principle that, in general, the judiciary will disfavor a legislated identity requirement. That can't be absolute, of course. We didn't just outlaw driver's licenses, but it does mean that there is, at the core of American society, a respect for privacy in the form of anonymity. Happily, some aspects of newer technology support that fundamental attribute of American life, as does some of the cultural history of its development. Attribution on the internet is one of the network's more alluring and elusive technical aspects. Network communication protocols do not, at their core, require identification. And so, connectivity comes, if you will, with the background assumption that anonymity will be allowed. That makes it technically hard, though not impossible, to identify those on the network who wish to remain anonymous. Ben Wittes and Jody Liu, writing for the Brookings Institution, found in a paper that they titled The Privacy Paradox that many aspects of technology support privacy in interesting ways. You might remember, they said, the old movie Bananas, in which Woody Allen goes into a store to buy a pornographic magazine. He's wildly embarrassed when the guy behind the counter shouts out, "Hey, Ralph, how much is the copy of Orgasm?" Today, pornographic images are freely available via the internet. Perhaps more valuable in the social context, web browsing can enhance one's privacy. And the other pillar of anonymity is cultural. Anonymity on the internet stems not just from the architecture of the communications protocols, it also reflects, I think, the quasi-libertarian streak at the core of the early internet society. For some of the original designers of the internet, anonymity was a way of giving individuals greater power to resist or avoid the government, a view to which they had an ideological commitment independent of their technical work. Consequently, even as technology labors to deliver more and more connectivity, some of the architects of this connectivity also build in security and anonymity frameworks. We're going to look now at two of them, Tor and Bitcoin. Tor is a free software program, and the name comes from an acronym that stands for The Onion Router. Operated by the Tor project, it is an anonymizing tool used worldwide by journalists, human rights activists, hackers, law enforcement, and others. It's called an onion router because trying to get to the original source is like trying to peel back the layers of an onion. It's nearly impossible. Tor encrypts messages and builds a volunteer network of servers around the globe to bounce that encrypted traffic in a way that evades detection. Those using Tor software encrypt their locations and bounce their messages across the network so that they're able to conceal the originating internet protocol or IP address. So if you download the Tor program, you can browse the web in a way that makes it very hard, some say impossible, for anyone to track what you're doing. Proponents say Tor protects personal freedom and privacy. WikiLeaks says it promotes transparency. Some governments say the program protects secrecy and criminality. For example, one use of Tor is to gain access to the deep web, also sometimes called the dark web. Among other things, this is an area where criminals lurk, operating black markets in which services and contraband can be purchased. You might be surprised to learn that a simple Google search, something you may very well do every day, gives you access to only a small fraction of the web. I've seen estimates ranging from 90 to 99% of the web being hidden in the dark. No one actually knows exactly how big the deep web is. Some of this data isn't necessarily hidden on purpose. It's just hard for current search engine technology to find and make sense of. But other parts of the web are truly dark. They are where users really do intentionally bury data. And it is these parts of the dark web that are accessible only if you use special browser software like Tor to peel away the onion-like layers of the dark web. Perhaps the best-known part of the dark web is a place called Silk Road, formerly run by a man who referred to himself as the Dread Pirate Roberts, a name that'll mean something to fans of the movie Princess Bride. The Silk Road was, before the FBI busted it, an online black market, mostly for selling drugs. You could get there only by using Tor. For obvious reasons, governments can perceive Tor anonymity as threatening because it might allow terrorists to communicate in secret or criminals. That's why the NSA, the National Security Agency, had a program known as Egotistical Giraffe, whose goal it was to peel back the layers of Tor. By all accounts, the program was unsuccessful at decrypting Tor communications, but it did develop a capability to identify those who used Tor on their machines. According to the government, anonymizing tools like Tor can be indicative of a desire to avoid surveillance, which, paradoxically, might make you more likely to be a target of surveillance. An analyst at GCHQ, the British equivalent of the NSA, once wrote in a memo that only, quote, very naughty people use Tor. But because software like Tor maintains the privacy of the source and destination of data and the people who access it, the capability might also enhance private transfers of information, goods, and services, legally as well as illegally. So it comes with a problem. How are you going to pay for those services? In the physical world, you hand over cash, a perfect anonymous monetary instrument whose value is known. What do you send across the dark web? Enter Bitcoin. Often abbreviated as BTC or XBT, Bitcoin is a digital, decentralized, and partially anonymous currency backed by no government. By the way, I'm told that proponents use Bitcoin with a capital B when talking about the system of exchange, and Bitcoin with a lowercase b when they're talking about an actual virtual coin. Bitcoin was invented, or perhaps created is a better way of describing it, by a pseudonymous mathematician named Satoshi Nakamoto, who described it in a 2008 paper as a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. One of the fun mysteries about Bitcoin is that nobody knows for certain who Nakamoto was, or is, or whether Nakamoto is a he, or a she, or a group of individuals operating under a single name. Nakamoto has claimed Japanese ancestry, though the written communications we have suggest that the author learned English in Great Britain. Bitcoin's defining characteristic is its lack of government or central bank backing. Traditional currencies are issued by a governmental authority. Libertarians might say by government fiat. And traditional currencies are sometimes pegged to a commodity or other resource, like the gold standard that prevailed until the early 1970s. Indeed, the oldest forms of currency are non-governmental units of exchange like salt or even seashells. Other units of account, like your obligations to American Express or MasterCard, are denominated in government-backed currency units and are fully convertible, at least in theory, to government-issued cash. Bitcoin, by contrast, is a purely digital currency that can be accumulated and stored in private electronic accounts. It can also be used much like a conventional payment network, such as PayPal, but its value is completely dependent on one factor: what other users of Bitcoin will give for it in exchange. Some Bitcoin users see this as its principal virtue. They think that government backing, either directly or more reasonably indirectly, is a form of government control. Hence, the development of a system that excludes government intervention is, for them, the singular achievement of Bitcoin. Other users are simply concerned that governments could always debase their currencies as a quick economic fix. But that function, storing value, isn't the only use of currency. It's also a means of exchange. To become convertible, Bitcoin had to provide a substitute for the other critical function of government. Its backing came with a guarantee of value and uniqueness. A dollar bill with a serial number is certified by the US government as authentic and one of a kind. When I give it to you in exchange for some goods, we're transferring value. And implicitly, the government is standing by to verify the authenticity of the currency that is used in the transfer. The government is also ensuring that the same dollar bill can't be spent twice. Indeed, governments around the globe spend a lot of time and effort in that surety function. By contrast, transferring a digital file, like a Bitcoin, runs the risk of duplicating the currency. Since a digital file is readily copyable, a secure digital system needs a way to prevent a user from spending the same Bitcoin twice. As a substitute for the government's verification function, Bitcoin relies on a complex cryptographic system that involves link to a ledger system known as the blockchain. Here's how that works. Bitcoins are created by, in effect, adding new pages to the ledger by solving increasingly challenging cryptographic puzzles. This is colloquially known as mining because creating a Bitcoin requires effort in the form of the use of computing power and energy, in much the same way that extracting gold from the ground requires effort. Once created, the history of each Bitcoin is cryptographically tracked in the blockchain ledger. So when, for example, I transfer a Bitcoin to you in exchange for a hamburger, the transfer is recorded in an indelible fashion in the blockchain. Thus, the mining function, combined with the blockchain record, assures the authenticity and the uniqueness of every Bitcoin transferred. Mining also has the virtue of creating new money without the need for a government to mint it. Some see Bitcoin as a cost-saving mechanism to eliminate the middleman for transactions, the financial institutions that handle those transactions. Thus, another key component of Bitcoin is that it operates on a peer-to-peer basis, that is, directly between the purchaser and a seller. By contrast, most other digital systems of payments, like Apple Pay or Google Wallet or PayPal, rely on the intermediaries to complete the transaction. Besides forfeiting anonymity, those exchanges also come at a cost. They aren't free. In essence, Bitcoin is, at least in theory, a frictionless mechanism of transfer. But because they aren't backed, Bitcoins are thinly traded, often held for investment and still relatively unfamiliar instruments of exchange. Their value has tended to fluctuate quite a bit. In a recent year, the value of a Bitcoin, according to my own tracking, dropped nearly 50%. On the other hand, if you look back before the emergence of the bubble in the market in late 2013, the value of a Bitcoin had increased by more than 300% in an 18-month period. As with most markets, the valuation depended a great deal on when you bought and when you sold. Bitcoin uses are growing, however. We have the first physical Bitcoin ATMs that exchange currency for Bitcoins. Tens of thousands of merchants now accept Bitcoin for their goods, and perhaps millions will do so before long. So let's end this discussion by trying to find a balance if we can. The growing use of biometrics is the one technology, above all others, that poses the greatest challenge to traditional concepts of anonymity. Put more affirmatively, biometrics, by definition, is a means to decisively and irrevocably fix a physical identity. That's why some civil libertarians and privacy advocates oppose almost all forms of biometrics. They believe that liberty derives from anonymity. Supporters of biometrics, pressing the alternate view, are of the belief that proper security is dependent on identification. Perhaps instead of depending solely on anonymity or full identification, Americans would be better served by a range of authentication options. Variable ways in which identity might be determined in whole or in part. Here are some of my thoughts. Anonymous political speech remains an important ideal for maintaining liberty. But outside of that specific realm, anonymity is a different and possibly weaker form of liberty. The American understanding of liberty interests necessarily acknowledges that the identity of those who have not committed any criminal offense can be collected even then for legitimate governmental purposes through biometrics. You must, for example, allow a photograph to be taken for your driver's license. On the other hand, liberty could be put at risk if identifying biometrics were required for even the smallest interaction with the government, like using a government public website. And so, we want to start asking whether between complete anonymity and full identity, we can develop gradations appropriate to select circumstances. Many interactions with the government or other people can be accomplished without requiring detailed personal information, though they would not be completely anonymous. Indeed, we already have the beginning of a graduated understanding of identity. Sometimes, identity is only needed to authenticate something, that the transaction is what it purports to be. In that context, identity is not essential. The credit card transaction needs to know that money is available, but in most cases, who's paying is not really critical information. In other contexts, though, you must know who or what you're dealing with. Thus, there's a spectrum of authentication and personal identification solutions available to the government. Consider a transaction where no identifying information about the individual is necessary, but actual authentication is needed. This might be the circumstance when data is going to be used in an ongoing government research study, for example. Contrast that with the situation where the actual identity is not important, but identifying information is essential. For example, in regulatory documents filed electronically by a company, who files it isn't important, so long as we can be sure it is the company that is filing. These examples demonstrate that our concepts of identity are based not upon absolute privacy expectations, but rather that any government infringement of our liberty can only happen with good cause. The right policy, I think, will allow citizens to voice controversial political viewpoints with the expectation that the government will investigate only those people who might truly be a threat to national interests. When a criminal or terror investigation is underway, we must expect that the spotlight of scrutiny will not turn on us individually without a good reason. Most interactions with the government fall somewhere in between these expectations of complete anonymity and a detailed investigation. We need to be able to continue to expect that the government will ensure that any possible infringement on liberty is commensurate to the interaction with the individual, and that the government has the technological tools to achieve this. If there is no true spectrum of authentication choices, from anonymity to pseudonymity to full identity, all expectations of privacy will erode, because the government will be forced to treat every interaction as investigative. In many ways, the implementation of new laws and systems to enhance surveillance are not universally anti-privacy and anti-liberty. Rather, new laws and practices can substitute one form of privacy intrusion, for example, the search of an electronic biometric data about an individual, for another privacy intrusion, the physical intrusion of body searches before entering an airport or a courtroom. But this means that legal analysts cannot make absolute value judgments. Each person weighs the utility of their own privacy by a different metric. For many Americans, the cost to liberty of a little less anonymity might not be too great if it resulted in a little more physical privacy in some circumstances. For others, the opposite result might be their choice. Reasonable people can disagree about when identification technology should be used. But taking a position that any use of biometric identification technology is anonymity destroying and privacy invasive ignores, I think, the positive benefits that this surest form of identification presents. It's not just that your DNA or your iris or your fingerprint are sometimes the surest proof of your innocence when wrongly suspected of crime. They are also the greatest potential gatekeepers of your genetic legacy and therefore of other privileges like security clearances or family identification. The true policy challenge here is in finding the most effective uses of the identification technology for liberty and security, not in labeling any of them as universally good or evil.